Ethan Caldwell was not an ordinary millionaire. Unlike other rich men who spent their money on luxury cars, huge mansions, and wild parties, he preferred to live a quiet life. He had built his fortune in the tech industry, making smart investments that turned him into one of the richest men in the country. But despite his wealth, Ethan was lonely. He had never married, never had children, and rarely trusted anyone. His heart had been broken too many times by people who only wanted his money. Then, one day, something strange happened. The world was shocked when news broke that Ethan had decided to marry not just one woman, but two twin sisters who were much older than him. Dolores and Marlene Greaves were not the type of women anyone expected a millionaire to marry. They were in their late 60s, plump, and lived simple lives before meeting Ethan. They had spent most of their years running a small bakery in a quiet town, known for their delicious pies and friendly nature. People couldn't understand it. Why would a man like Ethan, who could have married young, beautiful women, choose two elderly sisters instead? Was this a joke? A publicity stunt? Some believed the twins had tricked him, using flattery and lies to gain access to his fortune. Others thought Ethan had finally lost his mind. Even his closest business partners were concerned. But no matter what anyone said, Ethan was firm in his decision. He wanted to marry Dolores and Marlene, and nothing would change his mind. The twins, on the other hand, seemed surprisingly calm about all the attention. They didn't react to the rude comments people made about their age or appearance. Instead, they smiled in their soft, knowing way, as if they had a secret no one else knew. Some people started whispering that perhaps they were the ones with the real power in this unusual relationship. The engagement was announced with little fanfare. Unlike most rich men who threw extravagant parties for their weddings, Ethan kept things simple. A small ceremony was planned at his estate, with only a few guests invited. Reporters, however, were desperate to get more details. They waited outside the estate, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious twins who had captured a millionaire's heart. But something felt off. The twins never showed any excitement about the expensive gifts Ethan gave them. They didn't seem impressed by his wealth or his mansion. While other women would have shown off their engagement rings to the cameras, Dolores and Marlene kept theirs hidden. It was as if money didn't matter to them at all. Ethan noticed it too. He had been prepared for gold diggers, women who only wanted his fortune, but the twins didn't seem to care about any of it. They never asked for jewelry, never demanded lavish shopping trips. Instead, they spent most of their time whispering to each other, exchanging quiet glances that made Ethan wonder, what were they hiding? News of Ethan Caldwell's engagement spread like wildfire. Everyone had an opinion, and most of them were not kind. The idea of a young, successful millionaire marrying not one but two elderly sisters was too strange for people to accept. Some laughed, calling it the most ridiculous love story of the year. Others whispered that the twins must have cast some kind of spell on him. Social media was flooded with jokes and memes. Ethan, however, didn't care. He had spent years being judged by the world, and he had learned to ignore people's opinions. But this time, things felt different. Even people in his own circle, his business partners, employees, and old friends, began questioning his decision. At meetings, instead of talking about investments and business deals, they kept bringing up his upcoming wedding. "Ethan, are you sure about this?" one of them asked hesitantly. "People are saying strange things. They think the twins are after your money." Ethan leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Let them talk," he said. "I know what I'm doing." But did he? Even he had to admit that something felt unusual about the whole situation. The twins never seemed excited about their new life. Most women who married millionaires were eager to live in luxury, but Dolores and Marlene didn't act that way. They never asked about his wealth, never showed interest in his expensive cars, and never even spoke about what they wanted for the future. Instead, they spent most of their time whispering to each other when they thought no one was watching. It wasn't just Ethan who noticed. The house staff, who had been working for him for years, also felt uneasy. "Sir," his head butler, Mr. Langley said one evening. "The ladies, they are polite, but something is strange about them." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Strange? How?" They watch you," Mr. Langley said carefully. "Not in a bad way, but it feels like they are studying you, as if they are looking for something." Ethan didn't respond, but the words stuck in his mind. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the way the twins looked at him. It wasn't the gaze of women in love. It was something else, something deeper, something unreadable. Despite the rumors, the wedding day arrived. A small, elegant ceremony was held at Ethan's estate. Reporters weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop them from waiting outside the gates, desperate to catch a glimpse of the mysterious brides. As Ethan stood at the altar, watching Dolores and Marlene walk towards him, a strange feeling crept into his heart. The twins smiled, but their eyes held something unreadable. Were they happy? Or was there something else hidden behind those smiles? For the first time, Ethan felt a tiny flicker of doubt. Was he making the biggest mistake of his life? The wedding day arrived, and Ethan Caldwell stood at the altar, waiting for his brides. The sun was setting over his grand estate, casting a golden glow over the small gathering. Unlike the extravagant weddings of the rich and famous, this ceremony was simple. Only a handful of guests were present, mostly close business associates and a few distant relatives. Even they seemed uncomfortable, exchanging confused glances as they watched the unusual wedding unfold. Then the doors opened, and Dolores and Marlene stepped forward. The twin sisters wore matching ivory dresses that, although elegant, looked slightly old-fashioned. Their hair was neatly styled, and soft smiles played on their lips. Yet something about them felt different, almost as if they weren't brides but women with a secret only they understood. Whispers spread through the small crowd. Some guests struggled to hide their shock. Others nudged each other, their eyes filled with disbelief. Why was Ethan doing this? What did he see in them? But Ethan didn't care. He had made his decision, and he was going through with it. He straightened his suit, watching as the sisters walked toward him. Step by step, their hands gently brushing against each other. Unlike most brides, they didn't giggle, blush, or seem nervous. Instead, they walked with calm certainty, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The ceremony began, and the priest read the vows. Ethan, standing tall and composed, spoke his lines with confidence. When it was time for the twins to speak, Dolores was the first. "I do," she said, her voice steady. Marlene followed. "I do." Everything seemed normal, but Ethan felt something was off. Most brides were emotional on their wedding day, but the twins weren't. There were no tears, no excitement. They weren't even holding on to him like most newlyweds would. They simply stood there, their hands clasped together, as if they were more connected to each other than to their new husband. The priest finally announced, "You may now kiss the brides." A strange silence filled the air. The twins turned to Ethan, then exchanged a quick glance with each other. For a brief second, Ethan thought he saw hesitation in their eyes. Then, without a word, they each gave him a quick, formal kiss on the cheek. Nothing more. No passion, no deep emotion. Just a simple, polite kiss. The guests exchanged puzzled looks. This wasn't the kind of wedding they had expected. It felt more like a business arrangement than a marriage built on love. As the night continued, a grand dinner was served, and the newlyweds sat at the head of the table. The guests tried to make small talk, but the atmosphere remained strange. The twins weren't overly affectionate with Ethan. They weren't showing off their rings, nor were they enjoying the luxuries of their new life. Instead, they sat quietly, exchanging knowing glances with each other, as if waiting for something. And that was when Ethan felt it, the uneasy feeling in his chest. Something wasn't right, but he wouldn't understand the truth until later that night. After the wedding celebration ended, the guests slowly left the estate, still whispering about the unusual ceremony. Some laughed, some shook their heads, and others simply couldn't make sense of it. But inside the grand mansion, Ethan Caldwell was no longer thinking about what people thought. The wedding was over, and now it was just him and his new wives. The grand bedroom had been prepared for the occasion. A massive bed with silk sheets, soft candlelight flickering on the walls, and a chilled bottle of champagne waiting on the table. Everything was perfect, or at least, it should have been. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, loosening his tie. He expected Dolores and Marlene to be nervous or excited. After all, this was their first night as husband and wives. But when he looked at them, they were neither nervous nor excited. They were calm. Too calm. Dolores and Marlene stood near the door, their hands still lightly touching, as if they were drawing strength from each other. They weren't admiring the luxurious room, nor did they seem interested in celebrating their first night as a married couple. Instead, they simply looked at Ethan with a strange expression, one that sent a chill down his spine. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Dolores finally broke the silence. "Ethan," she said softly, "there's something we need to tell you." Marlene nodded. "Something important." Ethan straightened up. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady, though something in his gut told him he wasn't ready for what was coming. The twins exchanged another glance, then walked closer to him. Dolores took a deep breath, and in that moment, Ethan saw it, a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Not fear, not excitement, something deeper. "We didn't marry you for your money," Dolores said quietly. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Then why did you?" Marlene took a seat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Because we've been searching for you," she said, "for a very, very long time." Ethan frowned. "Searching for me?" Dolores nodded. "Ethan, we know who you really are." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Ethan's mind raced. What were they talking about? Was this some kind of trick? Marlene continued, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "You were taken from us a long time ago. You don't remember it, but we do." She paused, as if choosing her next words carefully. "Ethan, you are our brother." The words hit him like a hammer. "Brother." Ethan let out a short, nervous laugh, shaking his head. "That's not possible," he said. "I was adopted, yes, but—" Dolores leaned forward. "You weren't just adopted, Ethan. You were taken." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Everything he thought he knew about his life was about to change. Ethan stared at the twins, his mind refusing to accept their words. Brother. Taken. It didn't make sense. He had lived his whole life believing he was just another child who had been adopted by a wealthy couple. He never thought much about his past because, to him, his life began the day he was brought into his new home. He let out a nervous chuckle. "That's ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "I don't have any siblings. My parents told me I was adopted, but they never mentioned anything about—" Dolores cut him off gently. "They never mentioned it because they didn't know the full truth." Marlene reached into a small bag she had brought with her and pulled out an old, worn-out photograph. She handed it to Ethan with slightly trembling hands. "Look at this," she said softly. Ethan hesitated before taking the photo. When he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. It was an old picture of two little girls, standing beside a toddler with big, bright eyes and a familiar dimple on his cheek. A dimple just like his. He stared at the boy in the picture. The child looked exactly like him. It was him. His hands tightened around the photo. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dolores smiled sadly. "We've had it for years. It's one of the only things we have left from our childhood. You were our baby brother, Ethan. Your name wasn't always Ethan. It was Daniel. Daniel Greaves." The name sent a strange shiver through his body. It didn't sound familiar, yet at the same time, it felt like a lost piece of him had suddenly surfaced. He shook his head, still trying to deny it. "This doesn't prove anything. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe that's not me." Marlene sighed. Do you still have the small birthmark on the back of your left shoulder? Ethan's eyes widened. He did. It was a tiny mark, something he had noticed all his life, but never thought much about. No one else had ever mentioned it before. Dolores continued, and do you remember the lullaby that sometimes plays in your head when you can't sleep? The one with no words, just a melody. Ethan's heart pounded. He did. It was a strange tune, something that had always been there in his mind, but he had never known where it came from. Tears welled up in Marlene's eyes. That's the song our mother used to hum to us at night. She sang it to all three of us, before you were taken. Ethan felt his world tilt. He wanted to say it wasn't true, that they were lying, but deep inside, something told him they weren't. The way they looked at him, the way they spoke, it wasn't greed. It wasn't manipulation. It was love. And for the first time, Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift. His life was not what he thought it was. Ethan stared at the twins, his mind refusing to accept their words. Brother, taken. It didn't make sense. He had lived his whole life believing he was just another child who had been adopted by a wealthy couple. He never thought much about his past because, to him, his life began the day he was brought into his new home. He let out a nervous chuckle. That's ridiculous, he said, shaking his head. I don't have any siblings. My parents told me I was adopted, but they never mentioned anything about. Dolores cut him off gently. They never mentioned it because they didn't know the full truth. Marlene reached into a small bag she had brought with her and pulled out an old, worn-out photograph. She handed it to Ethan with slightly trembling hands. Look at this, she said softly. Ethan hesitated before taking the photo. When he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. It was an old picture of two little girls standing beside a toddler with big bright eyes and a familiar dimple on his cheek. A dimple just like his. He stared at the boy in the picture. The child looked exactly like him. It was him. His hands tightened around the photo. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dolores smiled sadly. We've had it for years. It's one of the only things we have left from our childhood. You were our baby brother, Ethan. Your name wasn't always Ethan. It was Daniel. Daniel Greaves. The name sent a strange shiver through his body. It didn't sound familiar, yet at the same time, it felt like a lost piece of him had suddenly surfaced. He shook his head, still trying to deny it. This doesn't prove anything. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe that's not me. Marlene sighed. Do you still have the small birthmark on the back of your left shoulder? Ethan's eyes widened. He did. It was a tiny mark, something he had noticed all his life, but never thought much about. No one else had ever mentioned it before. Dolores continued, and do you remember the lullaby that sometimes plays in your head when you can't sleep? The one with no words, just a melody. Ethan's heart pounded. He did. It was a strange tune, something that had always been there in his mind, but he had never known where it came from. Tears welled up in Marlene's eyes. That's the song our mother used to hum to us at night. She sang it to all three of us, before you were taken. Ethan felt his world tilt. He wanted to say it wasn't true, that they were lying, but deep inside, something told him they weren't. The way they looked at him, the way they spoke, it wasn't greed. It wasn't manipulation. It was love. And for the first time, Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift. His life was not what he thought it was. Ethan sat frozen, his fingers gripping the old photograph as if it held the answer to his entire life. His heart pounded in his chest. Could this really be true? Had his whole life been a lie? Dolores and Marlene watched him closely, their eyes filled with a mix of sadness and hope. They had been waiting for this moment for years, and now that it had finally come, they could see the struggle in their brother's eyes. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. If what you're saying is true, he said slowly, then tell me, how was I taken? And why didn't anyone ever find me? Marlene sighed, glancing at Dolores before speaking. It happened when you were just 2 years old. We were a small, happy family living in a quiet town. Our parents weren't rich, but they loved us. We had everything we needed. You were our baby brother, and we adored you. Dolores took over. One day, our mother took you to the market. She only looked away for a second, but in that moment, you were gone. Her voice trembled slightly. Someone took you, Ethan. Just like that, you vanished. Ethan's mind raced. He tried to remember, but his childhood memories were blurry. He had always assumed he was just an orphan, adopted by a wealthy couple who gave him a new life. But if what Dolores and Marlene were saying was true, then everything he believed was wrong. How do you know I wasn't just abandoned? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. Marlene shook her head firmly. Our parents never stopped looking for you. They searched everywhere, filed reports, begged the police for help. But there was nothing. No witnesses, no clues. It was like you had disappeared into thin air. Dolores added, years later, we found out the truth. You weren't just taken randomly. You were sold. Someone stole you and sold you to a wealthy family, one that couldn't have children of their own. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Sold. He thought back to his adoptive parents. They had always been loving, always treated him well. Had they known? Had they been part of this, or had they been lied to just as he had? His mind was spinning. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Why didn't anyone ever find me? Dolores sighed. Because the people who took you were powerful. They changed your name, gave you a new identity. By the time you grew up, you had no memory of us. But we never forgot you, Ethan. We never stopped searching. Ethan looked at the twins, really looked at them. Their faces, their eyes. There was something strangely familiar about them. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, something deep inside him that felt right. A lump formed in his throat. So, you married me to get close to me, to tell me the truth. Marlene nodded. It was the only way. We had to make sure you would listen. Ethan's hands trembled. His entire life had just changed in a single night. Ethan sat in silence, his mind drowning in thoughts. Everything he knew about himself had just been shattered. His whole life, he had believed he was just another adopted child, lucky to have been raised in wealth. But now, he was learning that his past was not about luck. It was about a stolen life. Dolores and Marlene waited patiently, giving him time to process it all. They had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that it was happening, they understood how overwhelming it was for him. Finally, Ethan took a deep breath. If this is true, he said slowly, then why now? Why tell me this after all these years? You could have just approached me, told me the truth, instead of all this. He motioned around the grand bedroom, the reminder that they had gone through with an entire wedding just to reveal the truth. Marlene shook her head. We tried, Ethan, she said. We tried for years. We sent letters, made phone calls. But you were surrounded by people who wouldn't let us near you. Your adoptive family made sure of that. Dolores added, they didn't want you to know the truth. They were afraid. Maybe they believed they had done the right thing by raising you. But deep inside, they knew the truth would ruin everything. So they erased your past, made sure you never had any reason to look back. Ethan felt a cold shiver run through him. His adoptive parents had always been good to him, always provided him with the best life. But now he had to wonder, had they known? Had they been part of this lie all along? He ran a hand through his hair. So why the wedding? Why go this far? Marlene gave him a small, sad smile. Because it was the only way you would listen. Dolores nodded. If we had just shown up as strangers claiming to be your long-lost sisters, would you have believed us? No. You would have ignored us, thought we were just after your money like everyone else. But this way, we made sure you couldn't walk away before hearing the truth. Ethan let out a slow breath. He wanted to argue, to say they had tricked him, but deep down, he understood. He was not an easy man to reach. His world was filled with fake people, and if they had come to him any other way, he probably wouldn't have listened. Still, the weight of it all pressed heavily on his chest. His entire identity had just changed. The parents he thought had saved him were now suspects in a bigger mystery. The women he thought he had married were not his wives but his sisters. He looked at Dolores and Marlene, his voice quieter now. "What happened to our parents?" The twins exchanged a painful glance before Dolores finally whispered, "They never stopped searching for you, but they didn't live long enough to find you." Ethan felt his heart sink. He had been found, but it was too late for the people who loved him the most.